And welcome to the second live event all about AI and ChatGPT, what it is and why it matters. Last week, we met software engineer Michelle Beeger and had a really wide-ranging conversation about the topic, basically getting into a lot about the ethics and the implications in society. Um, Today, we're really grateful to be joined by Roger Taylor, who is an advisor about responsible AI and also the former chair at the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. Roger, it's really, really great that you were able to join us today. Thank you so much.
Very pleased to be here. Thank you.
So we are all the way through. We really want to have your questions, so please send those in to us via the live chat or in comments. My amazing colleague Alice is on the comments this evening, so please do send them through and we'll get those and get those answered. So yeah, please send your questions. Roger, we're going to dive right in. I've got some questions for you to start with, if that's okay. So basically, to start with, you have had such a wide-ranging career. And I'm really, really interested as to how you went from kind of a journalist all the way to responsible AI expert and an advisor. Maybe you can give us a bit of an overview as to your career path so far.
Yeah, sure. So you're right. I actually briefly, before I was a journalist, I worked in advertising and I was absolutely atrocious at it and got sacked. And so that was actually how my career started, but I leave that bit off my CV. I then went into journalism and ended up working for the Financial Times and ended up going out to California in the late 90s to report on what was happening in Silicon Valley. Which was just a fantastic time to be there, and it was this was sort of 1997, so there were still conversations around the topic of what is the internet. That was still a question people might ask back then. It was all very new, and it was a remarkable for me experience. And the Financial Times had a slight problem in that every time they sent out a new reporter to go and see what was happening in Silicon Valley, within a few months they would think, what am I doing writing for a newspaper? The whole world of media is about to be transformed. I need to get out of this and get on board with what is happening. And at that stage, I had a number of ideas about doing a startup, which was the thing that everybody wanted to do. And we're looking at various options in privacy, which I was particularly interested in. But I ended up joining up with an old friend who's also a journalist, and we set up a business in healthcare information with a team inspired by a team at Imperial College who had shown what could be done with data that was held by the National Health Service in terms of understanding where there's a risk of serious failure on care. And so that was a very interesting journey. And what I learned a lot in that experience was this issue around the ethics of using data. Firstly, just how incredibly powerful it is, but also the fact that you can do pretty much anything with data. Once you've got the data, you can pretty much tell any story you want to tell. I mean, that's an exaggeration there, but there's a real problem about accountability for what you are doing with data. And the point being that it's never obvious to the person on the other end whether or not what you have done is correct, true, reasonable, fair, honest, whatever. The problem is it's not a very transparent process, and so it's really important that specific steps are taken to make sure that when people use data in these very powerful ways, they can be held to account by somebody who can actually tell whether or not what they are doing is legitimate, honest, fair, unbiased, etc. And so that I took a lot from that, and we did quite a lot of work at Dr. Foster on how you would go about doing this. And put in place various mechanisms to make ourselves accountable. And it was from that I went into regulation. I've worked with a number of regulators. I was chair of Ofqual during 2020, which was a particularly interesting experience. And I think there's a huge amount to learn from that about, this was not a complicated algorithm, but it was a stupid policy, putting it bluntly. And it was a foolish thing to try and do. And so there's a lot to learn from that. And then finally, the most recent thing was the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, which is probably brought together, everything that I'd been working on, everything that I was interested in. And this was, at the time, this was set up to be the model that this was set up under Theresa May. And the model at that stage was, we don't want to try and introduce a new regulatory layer, as it were, have a new law, a general law about AI and a new sort of regulator for AI. For a number of reasons. Firstly, because it's a general purpose technology and it's quite hard to, you can't regulate computing. What you can regulate is the things people might do with computers. So there's a problem about trying to regulate it as a generic thing in that sense. And you can see that very clearly from the fact that the issues depend so much on context, how you regulate self-driving cars using AI versus how you regulate automated advertising that uses AI versus how you regulate foundational models, or how you regulate diagnostics. There are some underlying common things there, but the specifics in each case depend very much on the context you're working in. So the model at that stage was that the way the UK would approach this is to say, we will leave sector regulators to take the lead, but we will establish an organisation, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, which will report to government on whether or not this is working. And it will be an independent body, and it will assess whether regulators are capable of doing this or whether something more needs to happen. And it will try and spread ideas, make recommendations where there are gaps in regulation, inform best practice. That was the model, and that's which I think was a very good model. I should say that with the recent white paper, policy's actually moved away from that now. And although the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation still exists, there's no longer a separate government body that has responsibility for this area. It's just been rolled into the department, which I think is a weaker approach. And given that the industry itself, it's unusual to have an industry that is crying out for regulation and a government that's reluctant to do it. It's normally the other way around. Okay. So I think that tells you something. I think our approach where we're at the moment is probably a bit too laissez-faire, to put it mildly.
Yeah. Interesting. So just to clarify then, so the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, it's not necessarily kind of a regulatory body. It's more of a giving advice and providing, synthesizing the best practice, but from within the government. Is that right, or is it an external?
That's right. No, the original plan was that it would be an independent body with a legal duty to advise government where there were gaps or problems with the regulation of AI. Which gives it a bit more kind of substance. It's now a part of a government department. Which, and the problem with that is simply that the government department is obviously also the department that is responsible for the policy. So if there's a failure in policy, it's quite hard for people working inside the department to report to government that they think there's a failure in the policy that they are obviously implicated in developing. So it's become a sort of a weaker mechanism, but still doing really good work. I'm sorry, although I think although the model is not right, I think the work the team is doing is fantastic, and it's a really it does still exist, but it's just been rolled into government, which I personally think was probably a mistake.
Great. Well, I suppose it's interesting because this is something that came up a lot last time with chatting with Michelle, about how is it being regulated, or at least what is the best practice on this, and is anyone overseeing the development of AI? How does this fit into the wider picture? This is the UK's approach. What about elsewhere? We've been seeing a lot about letters being sent by prominent people, mainly in America, I suppose, about AI and its development. I don't know. Where does this fit into the bigger picture?
So the bigger picture is, broadly speaking, what is going on is that in the EU, they are taking a very proactive approach. Mm-hmm. They've got an AI Act that they intend to pass, which will create a new regulatory framework for the use of AI for any products used or sold into the EU. Wow. Okay. And the truth is, they are further ahead in their thinking, I think it's fair to say, or certainly in what they are doing, than anybody else. It's in a sort of tangible way, which means that I think they will, in effect, set a a global benchmark for what the regulation of AI looks like.
Okay.
There are a large number of other countries and people, and I'm one of them, who actually is, although what they're doing, in some ways, you look at the EU AI Act, and it simply says, in some ways, what you would expect a well-run organization to do. It simply says, if you're doing something high risk, you ought to have a proper process for establishing that you're managing those risks appropriately, which is not an unreasonable thing to do. The worry, however, is that the structure of creating a sort of single mechanism to try and apply risk management across the whole universe of where AI is used, that is problematic. And I think it is problematic. But then if you go outside the EU, you have a lot of quite varied approaches that don't have quite the sort of coherence or the obvious impact that they've talked about. So in the UK, as I say, the white paper sort of says, well, look, there'll be a certain central government function in trying to keep a view on what's going on, but broadly speaking, we're going to leave it to sector regulators. And I think that feels a bit too laissez-faire, as I say. In the US, at a national level, it has been very laissez-faire, although the White House is now starting to suggest that something should be done. A number of bills have been put through Congress. None of them got through, but mainly focused on social media, which should be said. And then at a state level, you are seeing, so in New York, famously, they've got the Algorithmic Transparency Act that puts obligations on the use of any algorithm used, for example, in employment. So there's a lot going on. And I think one of the worries about this situation is it is very, very fragmented. Yeah.
Okay.
And it is pretty obvious that this is a global industry, right? This is going to be operated globally. So it's not helpful to have a really, a world in which everybody's slightly coming up with different ways to achieve the same thing. That just creates problems. It obviously creates a burden on industry, but it also creates a situation in which it's likely to lead to confusion. It's likely to lead to people not being clear as to what exactly they were supposed to do, or words being misunderstood, and things going wrong. So I do think that is something we should be concerned about.
Yeah, it sounds as if, it's a global issue, which a lot of people would recognize it's a global issue, the development of AI. We kind of need a global solution, and a global agreement of how we're going to tackle it, just like climate change or pollution, any of these other global issues. So,
and I'm hopeful. I think we will see something coming out of the G7 meeting in Japan this week about trying to encourage a more joined up international approach to this issue.
Fingers crossed, and yeah, hopefully everyone who's watching, might take a bit more of an interest after having taking part in this discussion. Speaking of taking part, please do send in your questions, because I could just totally dominate this conversation because Roger's so interesting. Please do send in your questions, and I'll be very happy to pass those across to Roger. Oh, and we have our very first question or comment. So thank you very much, Callum. So you've mentioned, I'm just going to put that onto the screen there. So definitely regulations in this instance need to be applied at a global level. Otherwise, don't you think it might be a bit pointless or even counterproductive if it isn't applied at a global level? I don't know, Roger, if you'd like to comment.
Callum, yes, I think you're absolutely right. And counterproductive is it. One of the things to recognise here, one of the reasons that countries are nervous about jumping to, or some countries are quite nervous about jumping too fast, is this what is basically a sort of geopolitical competition between fundamentally China and the West. And at the heart of this is less about, it's partly obviously about the military implications of these sorts of technologies, but it's also about just economic strength. And there's a recognition that AI is going to be a remarkable driver of productivity and economic growth. The Western democratic world, but when I say the word Western, obviously I mean Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, that community of nations, as it were, does have an issue with growth, and it has an issue with demographics, and it has a growing fear that it is losing out to China. And so this problem of fragmentation I'm talking about, it's a problem because we need to get our act together. We need because the industry's regulation will help this industry grow. In my view, I think it suffers from the fact that it is a bit of a wild west and nobody knows quite what they can trust. And so I think it would help to do that. I also think it would be a good thing if there was a united approach, ideally a globally united approach. And certainly this is an issue like nuclear safety, where you kind of want everybody to sit around the table together and work it out. But it is also particularly important that the democratic world come up with solutions here, because this is a threat to the democratic world if we cannot get our act together and use these technologies both beneficially and safely.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's kind of yeah, it's quite interesting how there's a lot of politics kind of wrapped up in there's an awful lot of politics,
Absolutely.
and it's a little bit certainly beyond my expertise, but really interesting. This is another thing that we're always trying to highlight is the fact that science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine, that they all, and the arts as well, they all really tie into to what's going on in society, politics, and you can't just tackle one issue or consider one issue in isolation. You have to think of them all in a multidisciplinary manner. So yeah, it's really interesting that that we're kind of going off onto these tangents. So cool. We've had
Sorry, I don't mean to say
discussions about kind of
but they
ethics,
are all connected.
politics, and
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, and philosophy. Even we'll probably get onto some more philosophy later. I think when we start thinking about what what we mean by artificial intelligence. Callum says, great point. Thank you, by the way. So any more questions, please do send them through. You'd be really just or comments or thoughts from what we're discussing at the moment. Something that I'm quite interested in. So we've talked about, you mentioned it's, at the moment, the kind of development of AI and the situation's a bit like the Wild West. What kind of ethical concerns do you see in terms of AI, ChatGPT, any of these kind of technologies? What would you say are the ethical concerns that we need to be aware of or thoughtful of?
So I think the starting point is the point I generally start from is it is not really tolerable to live in a world where with an insufficient understanding of the things you have built and which are driving the world. So we are already in that situation, I think, with media distribution. Yeah. The use of AI-driven recommender systems mean we no longer understand, and humans are not involved in how media is distributed. Now, I'm old enough to remember when Yahoo started, and Yahoo started as a directory, and it was humans, and they wrote out lists of websites and put them under topic headings, and you could kind of go down through these tree branches and find the thing website you're interested in.
Right.
But obviously, I mean, it didn't last very long, and we've gone now in a world where your interface with all the knowledge that is on the internet is managed by a robot. Yeah, whether it's ChatGPT or the Google search engine or the recommender system that delivers your feed to your Facebook page or TikTok or whatever it is. It is essentially what was once a human function, where people sat in rooms and talked about what do we think people want to know, and the channels you went through, whether it was a broadcast station or a newspaper or a book publisher, you could ask somebody what were they playing at, or you could identify that you knew what they might be coming from. We are now in a world where this pretty central function to how a society operates is now managed and run by robots. Right. And we don't really know what the robots are doing. Yeah. I mean, the YouTube recommender system, right? It is so phenomenally complicated over so many dimensions which there aren't even human words for these dimensions. We can plot them onto a 2x2 graph and sort of go, well, that one looks like it's sort of violence, and this one looks like it's sort of garden machinery or whatever. Quite the interface there would be. Anyway, so, I mean, we can try and understand what they're doing, but we are trying to interpret a machine that is thinking in ways that are not human ways of thinking. Yeah, and that's necessarily true because it's dealing with a data stream that is far more complex than we could understand in its raw form, and yet it's come up with a form of understanding of it. It's using it. Now, that's a scary situation. And so I think the starting point for me in terms of the risks is about, is this issue of humans remaining in control of the situation. And as I say, I certainly feel at the moment, in terms of media distribution, we do not have adequate control. What's also clear about this situation is that we can never go back to a world where we had the sort of human controls that we used to. Yeah, it's going to be a world in which different AIs act as proxies for different, how to phrase this, really different types of understanding, and which we can hold in balance to a degree that gives us a comfort that we know what's going on. Yeah, but I don't think we'll ever get better than that. I mean, if you take something like the question of is ChatGPT telling the truth? Yeah, we know it's not. I'll be very clear on that point. And the second point is there's no what's the gold standard. We're never going to have a sort of ruler that can tell us absolutely how truthful it is. But what we should absolutely be trying to do is get to a point where we have enough mechanisms and enough data coming out of those mechanisms to feel we have got a good enough handle on what is going on to be able to feel comfortable that we're living in a world where we are not just at the mercy of machines.
Right. Yeah, it's really quite scary when you put it like that. Because yeah, I mean, it's so much of a black box even now, that we're kind of just hoping, okay, well, not a lot has changed. You can still access your things and you can communicate with people, and there aren't, it all seems to be kind of normal. So maybe it's okay. But like you say, we're already seeing the effects in terms of people getting sucked into social media bubbles because of their recommendations and the kind of things that they see on Google, the recommended, search results. That's already quite scary, and I feel that we're just kind of ignoring that, and still, oh well, it's still going on despite some of these quite alarming, documentaries and things about how that's used. Is there any, just out of interest? This is kind of a bit of a tangent. Is there much regulation in terms of that? Because that's, we know that that's already an issue.
So social media is probably the area where people have become most alarmed and moved most quickly. So we have the Online Harms regulation in the UK. There's the Digital Services Act in Europe, and again in America there's been various attempts, but there's no national policy there. China has got a very firm policy. Singapore again. Now, one of the problems we've got is everybody's going in slightly different directions. So in Singapore, it's illegal to tell a lie, and a government department can tell you you've lied and find you, which is probably wouldn't fly in England.
I didn't realise that at all. Goodness me.
So they've taken that kind of, and China is now moving towards, for example, I think they're looking at licensing bloggers. So if you want to kind of comment on social media, you just need to register with the government. I think that's where it's got to, but you probably want to check that before quoting it. Very interesting difference between the UK and the EU. So the UK has formed this idea very much around harm to individuals. And this is I think it's a good, I don't have a problem with trying to do that, but there's a problem about how do you establish whether harm to an individual has occurred as a result of looking at social media. And on the one hand, you have the Molly Russell case where a child committed suicide after viewing if you look at it as just a normal person, you go, okay, that's not okay. You've got to stop doing that. Yeah. But in terms of the impact, for example, of social media on people's mental health, we don't really know what's going on. We have no idea whether this is just primarily a moral panic and there's some really sad, awful things that have happened. But broadly speaking, the world hasn't changed that much. Or if the world has changed really fundamentally and people, And without that level of understanding, it's quite hard to know. I suppose one of the things I worry about is we are spending a lot of time trying to write laws. Yeah, we're trying to come up with sets of words that we think capture the harm we are worried about. But all these words are worthless if you do not have some mechanism for determining whether this situation qualifies under those words, or that we can identify when someone has broken this law. So if we say you are under a duty not to cause harm, how are we actually going to tell whether this is going on? And I think the mechanisms that we currently have are very, very weak. So we're doing a lot of work to put words into statute books. We're not doing enough to actually establish how we would determine whether a law had been broken or not. So sorry, I got slightly off on a tangent. The point I was originally going to make was that in the UK, we're focused on harm. The EU law is much broader, and it does bring in, for example, an obligation on what they call very large operators, so people like Facebook and Google, etc. There's an obligation on them not just not to harm people, but also not to damage democratic processes.
Okay.
Which is an interesting one, because that's again a very hard law to know how you would interpret it. but the notion that the harm might not be to an individual, but it might be, as it were, every individual might feel great about and empowered by what they're learning and reading about. But if it causes society to disintegrate, that is problematic.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because, having to, yeah, I hadn't really thought we kind of. This is definitely going down the politics route, and again, this is all quite an opinion based discussion. But I'm just thinking that we having a law to maintain the kind of current social structure is quite interesting. I suppose that's actually what laws are for anyway. But
No,
interesting.
you're in exactly the right space there with that question, because the difficulty between the tension between the European law and the UK law is it sounds fine saying we don't want media to disrupt an effective democratic process. But it's not very far, as it were. That China says basically your number one duty is to maintain social cohesion. Yep, you've got to support the I've forgotten the exact words they use, but words about kind of the accepted public understanding, right? You're not to undermine the social consensus. Yep. That's obviously a no-no in any democratic country. At the other extreme, you can say all you got to do is not harm people. Yep. As long as you're not actively harming them, anything else is fine. Yep. But that obviously does allow for inflaming huge social divisions, and you're not obviously directly harming an individual if simply people read a lot of stuff and decide they can't live with their neighbors anymore. You could just say, well, if that's right, that's how that's people being free. And if people decide they can't stand their neighbors any longer, then that's their choice. But and in between is an attempt to say, it is an attempt to sort of say, well, there must be some point at which we're kind of enabling a reasonable debate without it becoming hateful and intolerant and etc. But again, we can play with these words, but unless we ground these words in some kind of mechanisms, I do think it's all really comes down to mechanisms. We are going to struggle. But you're right. There's a very I think it's going to be a couple of decades before we really get into this, but there's a pretty fundamental question that will need to be addressed at some point.
And it's really, sorry, around this kind of issue. Yeah, the thing that surprises me is that it's so complicated, and like we've been expressing, there's so many kind of politics and philosophical and societal implications that come into this. I feel like the development of AI and all of these kind of things, the technology is developing so quickly that we're going to be kind of stuck trying to make regulatory frameworks and think about
that is exactly where we're at the moment. And I think this is why the industry keeps saying you've got to do more on this. One thing I absolutely do agree with. We might not all agree about what the right level of regulation is or the right approach to regulation or etc. What it seems to be unquestionably true is the amount of effort that is going into working out how we control these things, how we interrogate them, what are both the legal, the social, institutional, and the technical mechanisms by which we gather an understanding of how we are being changed by the mechanisms we're building and how we understand them. Right, we are just miles off in terms of the scale of effort we should be making, given that this is absolutely going to transform the world. Okay. And one way you just sort of you sit back and let it happen, which is currently feels like but there are some pretty grim scenarios in that kind of situation. So I'm certainly not in favor of that.
So this is quite interesting, and again, this is turning into my Q&A. If anyone wants to jump in, please do put any questions and comments in the chat. The idea of this kind of catastrophic. So I mentioned this last time. I follow 80,000 Hours, who are a non-profit that encourage people to think about ways that they can use their career for positive impact. And they keep highlighting the careers of investigating AI safety and thinking about the kind of potential catastrophic effects of AI. Now, we always like to try and keep things positive and focus on the kind of hopeful future, and we'll get to that soon. But at the same time, it'd be really interesting to clarify. So just for the people who are kind of who've maybe heard about this and don't, can't really see other than perhaps, I mean, you think of how we're using AI at the moment, like you say, in social media pretty much any part of a business or Google and things that we interact with on a daily basis. How could it be catastrophic? Are you thinking about, the computers taking over kind of
No,
uh,
actually,
thing?
I'm less worried about. I mean, that is a
Okay.
scenario. That is a scenario, but that's much lower down to my mind than scenarios that are based on both effectively violence. That AI. I mean, broadly speaking, when technology massively changes the world, power shifts, and when power shifts, some people lose power and some people gain power, and it's quite hard for that kind of thing to occur without people fighting. And the parallel that's usually drawn as the obvious one is with the printing press and the collapse of Catholic, homogenous Catholic Western Europe, and 200 years of religious warfare, and
Hmm.
that kind of, where people simply adopted ideas that were inconsistent with the mechanisms of power, and Europe ended up in beset with wars raging across the continent.
Right.
And now, if you look at AI, its potential to do this is so much greater, and it's so much greater for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it is a technology that is directly relevant to your military capabilities as a country. So differences in development will shift, as it were, levels of military strength. The second impact is through economic power and employment and work. Yep. And so, as people have pointed out, the joblessness thing, I think, is it could happen, but I think there's a good chance that won't happen. But there's a real possibility of this entrenching power in certain situations and entrenching disadvantage in certain ways that adds to people's sense that the world is just not right for them. And then lastly, it changes the way information spreads through society. Yep. In much the way the printing press does, so that people's beliefs about the world and their views as to what is fair and reasonable will be changed dramatically. And perhaps one way to think about it is to say a sort of a peaceful, coherent, cogent society is one in which the means by which people understand the world around them, the means by which they earn their living and live, and the rules that govern society are in roughly in balance, and there's it can shift and change and adapt to circumstances without breaking. And what AI is very likely to do is to break that. And so navigating those moments is going to be very hard. And that is why I do feel very strongly that we need to be doing so much more to get on top of this. And one of the things that makes it particularly hard is that to do this, we kind of need to understand as well what it is doing to ourselves and to our society. And that's something that's perhaps a bit uncomfortable to think about. But I do think we need to be doing a lot more on that. I thought it was very interesting that the Association of Mathematical Consciousness Scientists, who I didn't know existed, wrote a letter saying they were very worried that we weren't doing enough research on consciousness and would not know when a robot was conscious, which I think is a fair question. And I would certainly support more research on consciousness. But I would also really like to see a more active approach to both understanding the effect of AI on people's lives, and understanding the effect of AI on people's beliefs and views about their lives. And I think we kind of need to get on top of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly it's something that we find, we're thinking that as a science centre, we have an important role to kind of, help connect people with the current research and the current, I don't necessarily want to say the truth, but at least, what's the current science on a certain important topic. And it's already challenging enough to counter, the things that people see on social media, probably through AI and things. But, it's going to get a lot worse, most likely.
It is going to get a lot worse.
Yeah.
It is astonishing that the sort of, as it were, the nature of truth has become a sort of contested political issue now. I mean, it's beyond crazy.
Yeah. So I wonder, I mean, there are some really nice kind of models. I mean, we look at Finland quite a lot actually, and thinking of how they kind of train through their education system, and I think through society in general. They're pretty good at training people to be more resilient to fake news. I think is their particular leaning, but also.
I do think that's really important, and
Mm,
I think a really important use of ChatGPT is, as it
mm,
were, as a mechanism to enable young people to understand how this works. So, I mean, because there's a lot of worry. I thought when New York schools banned ChatGPT, I thought that was just the wrong response.
mm,
Because on the one hand, it is plainly actually it's incredibly useful educationally. I mean, it kind of like it can pull out information from all over the place. It's also astonishingly sort of unreliable and liable just to tell you whatever you want to hear. But that is a fantastic educational tool. If you want to sort of be able to start to navigate this, we want to be getting young kids working with this stuff now. We want to be looking at them, see how if they ask a question and they get the answer, how do they respond to that? How do they check the truth of it? How do they assess the incredibly plausible answers that ChatGPT will pull out of thin air?
yeah.
So I think it's a fantastic educational opportunity there, and I think we should be looking at how we can use it in schools. And I do think education training is a huge part of it, but I would also caution against being too just recognizing the degree to which this is a collective problem as well as just an individual problem.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yes, I suppose what I'm saying is that being resilient to misinformation is a really good thing
Mm,
to develop in people.
mm.
But so I mean, even the most resilient people to misinformation are part of a broader
Oh, I
society that
see.
has a big impact on how they think about the world and what they believe and what they decide is
Sure.
intolerable and what they
Yes.
decide they can no longer live with and they must now take to violence to prevent.
Right.
These are not things that you can solely tackle, in my view, by making people resilient to
Yeah.
misinformation.
Absolutely, yeah. And no, I completely understand. It's part of a wider problem. We need to have the structures in society to, yeah. I really liked your idea actually of having, getting young people and to actually, to be honest, anybody to experiment with ChatGPT. Set up an account. It's free, right? And
Yeah.
you can just ask it questions. Obviously, don't don't get stuck down
It-
a rabbit hole.
that's
But it's a great
exactly,
idea.
and instead of saying like you write an essay on Louis the 14th, but you mustn't use ChatGPT,
Mm,
I would I think the homework should be go and find out from ChatGPT
mm,
the or any other resource on the internet
yeah.
the best you can answer this question about Louis the 14th, and then don't hand in the essay, just show us what you did, kind of
Yeah.
like almost all we want to see is your what questions you asked, how when you were sort of suspicious, how you double check things. That would be a proper piece of homework.
Yeah, absolutely, and it'd be quite a nice exercise to get people to do that process. And these days, I don't even know if it's trained in school. The kind of searching appropriately, finding
Yes,
trustworthy information, for example, is an important skill, and it's not necessarily taught in education. And these days, you just got to use the tools that you've got. Just
exactly right.
in the same way that we don't get people to do too many. We use calculators, for example, in maths now as just a matter of course, rather than having to necessarily. Although you should probably do long
I
division
think
and
you should
things.
probably. I'm inclined on times tables, but anyway, we'll return to that.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. And I'm trying to remember the name of there are, it's probably more than one, but the
Mm,
organisations that do go into schools and
hmm.
focus on this. That how do you find reliable information?
Well, I have to look them up actually because we need to work with them. That sounds great. Yeah, just another reminder for anyone who's just tuned in to send in your questions. We're really keen to take any that you might have. I've still got plenty. Roger, I won't keep you too long. At the same time, you've got to have an evening too. I hear all the lovely bells in the background. Have you got
Yes,
a
sorry,
bird
that's the
nearby?
bells down.
It's really nice.
Yes, yeah,
um, yeah, another thing. So we kind of focused on the kind of the negatives and this potential kind of catastrophic effect. And actually, I hadn't really appreciated the really important point about the potential to lead to violence and instability in society. As that is really quite scary. And yeah, we definitely need more people working on AI safety and quickly. I think it sounds like. Maybe can we take a little different tack? And
yeah.
how do you think there is a how would you see a positive future of with AI working in
Yeah.
harmony with society? really
Yeah.
like
So,
to see what you
and
think.
I should perhaps just be clear.
Yeah.
There's no way of stopping it, right? It'll happen. My guess is that, I mean, some people think it'll end in properly in tears, like, sort of existential, and I don't, who knows, it could do, but I don't think it will. I think we will get through it, and I think it will create a far better world than the one we live in. I'm fundamentally an optimist about the future. My worry is primarily about getting from here to there without too much chaos and catastrophe in between, and while recognizing that the risk that actually it does go completely off the rails and is totally catastrophic is not, it is a real risk, and we need to keep it in mind. But broadly speaking, I remain an optimist that in the long run it's all going to be fine. But the long run in these sort of situations can be like 3-4 generations, so it can be painful in the meantime. In our conversation, we've been talking about sort of quite big picture stuff about how it affects society, and I do think those are important questions. But obviously, more immediately, there is just the sort of the day-to-day stuff, and the two connect. If you know what I mean, there's a continuum, but just how you have effective mechanisms for checking about bias, and this bias is quite an interesting one as well, because it ties these two things together. There's a question about the right mechanisms for understanding bias and how legitimate decisions are made as to what counts as discrimination and is illegal or should be illegal, and what is a reasonable distinction to make between people. Yep. And it's never easy making. So, for example, if you just use qualifications to employ people, you will have a social gradient. Yep. So more richer people will tend to have better GCSEs than poor people on average. Yep. So if you simply say we've got to have this level of maths GCSE, you disproportionately harm one section of society than another. Yep. Okay. And you've got to take the view of, is that reasonable because you really need it? And to what extent does it really reflect people's maths ability, as opposed to simply reflect the luck of the draw in terms of which school they went to? Yep. Because if that's all it's telling you, then it's not reasonable to reject people on that grounds.
Okay.
So it's really, these are difficult things to get right. And it's both, we have a problem right now about putting in place the mechanisms to manage bias in AI systems. Right, that's a problem right in front of us right now, and we need to solve it. But it ties into our earlier conversation, because if you don't solve it, what you do is you create a society in which more and more people feel that it's unfair, and they feel trapped by it, and they feel they can't get out of it. So, and that then leads to some of the the longer term problems that we that I was sort of rather alarmingly, perhaps, but I do think it is alarming. We need to be aware of. So there's a real connection between just getting to grips with the day-to-day stuff right now, and along with the day-to-day stuff, there's bias and accuracy and reliability at the top of the scale in terms of probably a lot of the issues we are looking at, and we are we have a long way to go to still to establish consistent ways of approaching this, and it's only it's become ChatGPT has just made it so much more evident to everyone, because there's till ChatGPT came along, I think there was a slight sense of, okay, we can get a grip on this. We've got approaches to accuracy, and I think that'll work. And then there was suddenly, like, I mean, I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the technical community who said, well, this is obvious, isn't it? What were you expecting? And the rest of the world, who really had, and I count myself amongst that, I was not up to speed with quite where it got to until when I went on ChatGPT, like most of the world, they went, oh my God. What have they done?
Right.
And it's incredibly impressive. But in terms of feeling like we've got some handle on how to manage this stuff, it just threw everyone into a tailspin, because it's pretty clear, if you want to know about accuracy or reliability on a system of that sort, we've got a long way to go.
Right, because it doesn't help that it's a completely black box. We don't know how it's operating, and it does make things up. Like you said, it'll lie to you. And we're actually in the discussion before this. You mentioned that it would lie to you and then apologize profusely when it gets it wrong when you call it out.
Yeah, and we're talking about how it's very hard. It's so good at, because it's basically designed to impersonate people, and so it does impersonate people, and it makes stuff up, and it's sort of we're talking about the fact that it's very hard not to start investing it with personality, and it becomes, in my experience, it becomes sort of slightly defensive and rather sort of constantly sort of trying to justify itself and being overly apologetic. And one of the problems about it is of course, what the machine's actually doing is just in response to the question you said, actually, I think that doesn't sound right. Are you sure this is true? I was saying that they'd given an answer. I said, I don't think that's true. And it immediately goes, oh, no, you're quite right. That's absolute nonsense. I'm sorry I said that. It's a different answer. And you have no idea. Well, okay, is that just a lie? Are you just saying that? You think that's what I want to hear, which, roughly speaking, that is exactly what it's doing. But it's quite interesting that that sort of interaction. And one question is to say, well, should we be? I mean, to what extent do we need to establish its reliability? And this is like a big issue if, for example, in law firms, right? So I was talking to at a meeting where somebody from a law firm said they were worried because hard-pressed lawyers in a corporate law office, someone comes down with an urgent question. What are they going to do? They're going to go find a counsel and pay them a bunch of money, etc., or are they just going to go on ChatGPT, and get an answer and say it's probably right? Maybe do a couple of So the risks around this stuff are considerable. For just general inquiries, you could say, look, this is a massively unreliable system that is there simply because it does provide a gateway to a lot of information, and it's on you to work out the reliability. Fine, but it is being rapidly adapted by companies across the board for all sorts of purposes, and quite correctly in the sense that it's like it plainly has an ability to be efficient in pulling together information that is just unparalleled, and we can't just turn away from that. I mean, it's really useful. But in that scenario, you obviously do have to have some mechanism for trying to establish some degree of trustworthiness and reliability. And simply applying human mechanisms, i.e. the person who uses it then has to sort of check it, sort of all right, and we get away with that for a bit maybe. But the truth is, obviously, people are just a bit lazy. And if this machine keeps giving you plausible answers and you've checked it 15 times, it seems right. It doesn't feel like it's a very strong defense to say what we're going to do is just rely on the people to make sure what it tells them is true. It feels like we probably are going to have some ways of judging the truthfulness of a large language model. And we have quite a long way to go to work out how to do that.
Right. Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're using it.
Yeah. It's really quite alarming. I think.
Sorry, I don't mean to be alarming.
No. It's quite interesting because the thing that I find really surprising, I suppose, is the fact that it's just learned to string words together, and it's thinking about what should the next word be. This is what Michelle was saying last week, and you've alluded to as well. I'm it's boggling that it can come up with something that seems so coherent.
Absolutely right. And it does make you wonder. And this is why I thought that, the stuff about consciousness and understanding how the human mind works as well. I thought someone mentioned a fascinating, I haven't read it, but someone did a piece of work looking at the AI that won at Go, the game.
Yeah.
And they were trying to work out how to beat it. And what they established was that the thing that's certainly true about large language models is they do not have, or it seems to be pretty evidently true, they do not have the underlying conceptual framework that a human mind has. Right. Which is why it'll say sort of crazy things like the famous story of the, anyway, it says things that seem to indicate it does not have the sort of conceptual model that a human would have that would make it pretty obvious that's not a reasonable thing to say. But with the Go situation, as I understand it, someone published a paper saying they've looked into this and they tested it and identified certain concepts it did not seem to have. Right. For example, the concept of a circle.
Right. Okay.
So natural to a human being, and it didn't have it. Okay. And they were then able to take advantage of the fact that the AI did not seem to have certain concepts. It could just produce what was likely to be the best move, but it was not based on any sort of framework or underlying set of concept. Consequently, they were then able to beat the AI because they could make use of this weakness. So it's quite an interesting example of this. But I think one of the things that makes LLMs problematic is the fact that they are intensely plausible. They're not honest, and I'm using quite a human word there, honest, and they don't have the sort of conceptual underlying framework that means a conversation between a human and an LLM has the same qualities as a conversation between a human and a human would have.
Right, indeed, and I suppose if it doesn't have the same moral code, because it doesn't really know what morals are and what humans are, and therefore how
Yeah.
they need to be protected and other animals and beings and things. It doesn't have that understanding like we do. Then it's just applying it. It doesn't. It's not going to be meaningful or yeah. It's
That's probably right. I mean, it's possible, of course, it'll turn out that in fact that's in. I think we know it isn't, but you could imagine a world in which it turns out actually that's just how humans operate.
maybe, yeah. So
Which
this is
is
where we kind
probably
of get
quite
into the
depressing, but yeah,
yeah. This is where we got into the philosophical kind of
yeah.
discussion of when we kind of whittle down intelligence, consciousness, and everything. I don't know, because how are we going to be able to say that, okay, at this point the AI is conscious? If it gets to that stage, will it ever be conscious? Will it ever? Do you think? I mean, this is
I
it's a
think
tricky
I
one.
think I think it's very likely to get to a point. I think our own understanding of consciousness, which does seem to be taking huge strides, it's not really I know, but I loved Anil Seth's book that came out quite recently, and sort of
Yeah.
and which took this very kind of pragmatic approach to it, which you've just got to strip it down and work out exactly what's doing what, and I think what's quite disconcerting about that, of course, is the more you do that, the more you reveal human consciousness to be not some mystical property, but a
Mm,
kind of quite a mechanical one.
mm,
The question of whether you then have to you want to recreate that in a machine, as it were, whether it's something you'd want to do, B, whether it's something that would just naturally occur if you kept training it to on in the way that a foundational model is. You just show it human behavior and it models it. Whether that
mm,
would just naturally occur, that seems quite plausibly true. But I don't,
mm.
I'm just having a clue, to be honest. I've been making it
Yeah.
up. The one thing that does seem to be certainly true is that AI will be able to create things that it
Mm,
is really hard for a human not to respond to as if it were a human.
right.
So the ability to create both images and text and voice that is wholly compelling as being human.
Mm.
That seems to be pretty well demonstrated, and so that's that. And once you're confronted with something that you can't help but feel is conscious, that has a pretty big impact.
Yeah, that's when it gets a bit scary. And I mean, we saw there have been a few people who've kind of thought that the AI is conscious and it's sentient now, and we have been fired from their jobs and things for saying so and believing so, and other things, I suppose. But yeah, it's a tricky business. We're already getting to that stage at the moment, and
We
yeah,
are getting quite. I mean, personally, yes, I kind of feel we're probably a bit further away
okay,
than some people do. I thought that the sort of suggestion about that Google's model was sentient was a bit daft, to be honest. But
okay.
you know, who knows? I mean,
But it can trick
we
you
haven't.
to
I mean,
think.
exactly, and the
Yeah.
problem is we haven't got a sort of a there's not a clear enough definition of what it is to be conscious
Mm,
to say.
mm,
At one point, people would say, uh, it's like with the animal comparisons, and
mm,
we've moved very rapidly to realizing that you get go back 100 years and people felt there was obviously sort of very little connection at all between the consciousness of a dog and the consciousness of a human. But
mm.
anyone who's got a dog, it's pretty obvious that there's quite a lot of similarity between the way dogs behave and the way humans behave.
Yeah.
So we without a definition and clarity about
Mm,
what consciousness is, I think the conversation about um, what we are going to regard as consciousness in machines is quite difficult
mm.
to make sense of.
Right.
But it goes back to the point about the Association of Mathematical Consciousness Scientists that it is an area that does need more research.
Yeah. Well, just think of all the amazing kind of potential job roles that are out there and areas of interest, for
Yeah,
potential students who might be watching or
yeah,
afterwards or now. Yeah, it's a really exciting and interesting area, and I want to kind of keep bringing it back to before we finish off that kind of potential positive future. So we've kind of talked a little bit about how we might get there in terms of thinking about regulation, thinking about how we need to address the immediate issues of things like bias and other things which are having an effect on us right now, and really the whole thing is um, what would you see then as the positive future of like, okay, how can we be using AI? Imagine we give you a magic wand and you can say, right, in 10 years time or so AI will be working in a positive way, and how will that look like, do you think?
Okay, so my view of this, right? So this is okay. So the simple question is: medicine will be much better, transport will be much more efficient, electricity distribution will be phenomenally more efficient,
Right.
scientific discovery will happen faster, everything's going to be better, right? All the
Okay.
things that happen now are going to be better. Okay,
Okay.
that's a reasonably kind of I think a fair way of putting it.
Mm.
Um, the and on the creativity point, I do think my own view is that this will simply enhance creative abilities of humans. So I'm not the notion that sort of it's a bit like the idea that photography would put painters out of business, or
Okay.
I'm old enough to
Right.
remember debates in the 80s that the drum machine might put drummers out of business. I don't think that I don't think that's very plausible. But I think lots of stuff could be made much more efficient.
Mm.
I think the bit that is hardest, and which I do think holds out huge hope actually for humanity, is what AI is obviously also very good at doing is understanding humans. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at an area like healthcare, there's loads we can do in terms of sort of understanding ourselves and changing ourselves, as it were, through use of drugs or devices, etc. But it does force us to sort of have a think about who do we actually want to be. Yeah.
Okay.
And to take a very simple example, again going back to bias, this question of sort of at what point do we want to apply, sort of in our own heads, as it were, we have this sort of tension between justice and mercy.
Mm.
Justice is
Mm.
unforgiving and exact, and the rules are applied, etc. And
Mm.
but we all know that means you get situations where everyone looks and goes, "That's wrong." Yep.
Mm.
And then
Mm.
mercy is a sort of more human quality of machines have no mercy. Machines just do what they're told.
Mm.
Um, and so the question about what sort of world do we want to live in terms of how do we want human judgments to play into this, even if they, as it were, kind of or do we not want that, or do we purely want algorithmic fairness, or do we want
Mm.
human judgments to be allowed to happen,
Mm.
even at the expense of lower algorithmic fairness? These kinds of issues are ones that I think the growth of AI will help us understand and work through in the best possible scenario,
Right.
and give us greater clarity, about what it is to be a human, and what it
Mm.
is to be fair, and where you should have the freedom and space to be yourself, and where you shouldn't. But this is difficult stuff, and this is the stuff people fight over. This is the stuff that people get really angry about.
Right.
And I think AI is what I think the great benefit of it is going to be us understanding ourselves and working out how to live well and with each other. Yeah.
Right.
But in the process, there's going to be some pretty difficult conversations. Hopefully,
Okay.
just conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It sounds like it's going to be a bumpy road getting there, but yeah, let's hope that we can aim for that
Well,
positive
that was
future.
maybe going
I
a bit
really
too far out into the future. Then.
no, no, no. I like that. I mean, we're all about a vision of a positive future. And we need to work towards it through
Okay.
the way that we operate. So yeah, I think that's actually a really nice point to finish on. I don't know if we have any extra final comments while we wrap up. So I'm just going to see if there are any like really important things that I really wanted to discuss. I think we've covered so much actually, and I need to go and look loads of things up actually as a result, Roger. I don't know if there are any extra points that you'd like to put across that we haven't perhaps covered yet, or
No, except the only thing I'd say is just the importance of doing
mm,
more on this stuff. So
mm,
particularly for students working in this area,
yeah,
and actually one thing I do think is kind of both encouraging. Yeah, it is encouraging. Is, as it were, the sense of alarm amongst lots of people working in the industry
hmm,
about this problem, and the huge desire amongst people working in the industry to try and get to grips with this,
right,
which is
yeah.
a really positive thing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It sounds as if there's a lot of motion in the right direction. At least there's a lot of interest in it now, which is good. And there's hopefully going to be some kind of agreement, some movement to governments to making sensible regulations and things. But Yeah, that was so interesting. Thank you so much,
Right?
Roger.
No
Really,
worries.
really appreciate
No
your
problem.
insights. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. If you do have any follow-up questions, I'm sure, Roger, would you be happy if I could pass
Yes.
those on to you if we had
Yeah.
any?
Please do.
Wonderful. That's great. So, yeah, if maybe if you're tuning in later, or if you're there and you haven't quite formulated how you're going to express that yet, please do write it down. Either I think as a comment is fine, and we can pass this on to Roger and get those answered for you. So that's kind of it at the moment for our kind of AI ChatGPT little mini series, because it was such an interesting and broad ranging topic. We still haven't covered everything, and maybe if there are more kind of discussions that we have with the public as we go along, or maybe if more comments, maybe we can always have another one of these. But hopefully that was enjoyable, interesting, and has given you something to think about. Yeah, have a go on ChatGPT. That could be like a
Yeah.
little follow-up thing we do. Even just a live kind of experiment with it would be quite interesting. But who knows what kind of we've gone off on tangents here in terms of politics and ethics and things which no, I'm certainly not really qualified to talk about. But things which are just kind of very interesting. And yeah, have a play on ChatGPT anyway, and investigate it, because like we've said, there are useful features of it, but take it all with a big pinch of salt, and heck, maybe even try and find when it's being disingenuous, if it can be untruthful or making things up. Try it, experiment, and try to see if you can get an understanding of how it works. I always find it quite interesting, just as a note, to kind of say, why did you say that, and what was your reasoning
Yeah.
behind that, and then getting it to think through that is actually quite an interesting process. And like you say, maybe it'll help us to better understand ourselves eventually, through the processes that we go through interacting with it. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you so much, Roger, for your time. And that's the end of the live stream. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye.
I'm going to try and work out how to end the live stream. There we go.